Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. We are letting everyone in now, and yes, we have 42 participants in the meeting. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this OECD Washington Center webinar on the impacts of COVID-19 and youth. My name is Danny Ryan. I'm a public affairs and marketing consultant at the OECD Washington Center, where our job is to communicate the work of the OECD to the US and Canada. We also act as a resource for legislators in the executive branch, the wider policy community, as well as the hundreds of US and Canadian government delegates who drive the work of the OECD through our many committees. We are eager for you to engage with us, and we encourage you to visit our webpage at oecd.org/Washington to sign up for alerts and stay informed on information that's relevant to your work. We have a really action-packed webinar today, which we're very excited about, and we're delighted to be joined by several distinguished speakers. Today we are joined by OECD Deputy Secretary General Jeffrey Schlagenhauf, OECD Policy Analyst Moritz Ader, AIESEC Global Vice President of Public Relations Noelle Guirola Paganini, Y7 Delegate for Young Diplomats of Canada Rahul Palan, and Thamar Harrigan, Director Youth Summits YPFP. So a little bit of a run through on how we're going to do today's webinar. In a few moments, we will hear opening remarks from Noelle. We will then get a presentation from Moritz, who will present the main findings of the recently published OECD report, Youth and COVID-19. Afterwards, we will hear perspectives from Rahul, followed by a Q&A, after which we'll hear closing remarks from Thamar and Jeff. For the Q&A, we encourage you to post questions in the chat box. And I will try and get to as many of them as I can. Please state your name, your organization or university, and then the question. So for opening remarks, we are delighted to be joined by Noelle, who will be giving AIESEC's views and perspectives on the impact of COVID-19 on youth. In her role, Noelle builds purposeful partnerships with like-minded organizations to engage and develop youth together. At AIESEC, she is responsible for strengthening the organization's brand awareness and credibility, overseeing global strategic alliances, coordinating crisis communications on behalf of the organization, and representing the organization at global external events. She is passionate about youth engagement, leadership development, and the Sustainable Development Goals, her favorite being SDG 17 partnerships for the goals. Noelle, we are delighted that not only are you able here to speak, but we're also delighted that AIESEC were able to partner with us. So Noelle, I'm going to spotlight your video, and I hand the floor over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I am also delighted to be here today representing AIESEC and also representing young people's views and perspective on how we are facing this COVID-19 crisis. As well, I want to say thank you for organizing this space and really making it accessible for young people to be part of this conversation and inviting AIESEC as well to be part of it. As Danny already mentioned, my name is Noelle Guirola, and I am responsible for public relations in the global headquarters of AIESEC, and we're based in Montreal, Canada. There is maybe some of you here that already know about AIESEC, and there is maybe some that don't know. So for those that do, bear with me while I introduce AIESEC to those that don't know about AIESEC yet. So AIESEC is the largest youth-led organization, and what do we mean by led is that all our positions is at a local level in the universities or in the national chapters are filled by young people between 18 to 25 years old. And we are represented in more than 110 countries and territories and in more than 2,000 universities worldwide. Yearly, we engage around 80,000 people either in our membership program or in our practical experiences that we provide to young people. We focus on developing leadership. Leadership is the one keyword that always is in the mouths of young people and AIESEC members. And we facilitate those through cross-cultural volunteering experiences or practical experiences. And why do we say cross-cultural is because when AIESEC was founded back in 1948, cross-cultural understanding was really important in the context that our society and our world was facing. So that's why we continue to advocate for it, and we continue to fight for cross-cultural understanding. And because we want, and why do we focus on practical experiences in that sense, is because we want to ensure that young people can become more employable for the future and also active citizens in their community. This is not the first time that I'm able to attend a meeting of the OECD. I was really privileged and I felt really honored to be in Paris back in November in a meeting where we were talking about aging societies. And I was able to bring the voice of youth and represent the voice of youth in that matter. And we talked or different conversations, and I brought some insights from one of the initiatives we run in AIESEC, which is the Youth Speak Survey. The Youth Speak Survey focuses on gathering insights of young people on their worldviews, their career aspirations, and what leadership means for them. And some of the insights that I brought were really connected to one of the topics, that is career aspirations. And I talked about how young people do not believe that university or college is preparing them to the trends that are shaping the future of work. And at the same time, they believe that practical experiences are one of the best ways to really learn and develop themselves. So these are, for us, was like reinforcing why we are doing what we're doing as an organization. But I also talked of how difficult it is for young people to access these practical experiences. And nowadays it's not difficult. It continues to be difficult, and even potentially has become even more difficult for young people to keep on learning and keep on building their capacity through different like internships or at university. And all that is because we unfortunately are facing one of the biggest challenges that our generation and our society has ever seen. And that is the COVID-19 pandemic. Its economic and social impacts have affected like really different aspects of our lives, and not only for young people, but different parts of society. And I do believe that young people are being affected the most. And if we look at it in the long term, young people are will be the ones that are affected the most about this crisis that we're facing. And AIESEC has not come unharmed out of it. In the contrary, we as AIESEC had to stop our operations, and we had to stop the one thing that we do, that is develop develop leadership through practical experiences. We were devastated to do this, but we did not let ourselves be stopped. And we said, okay, how can we find opportunities out of this situation? And that's why we decided to do it virtually. How can we explore developing leadership virtually? And we did that by having an event called Global Leadership Day, where we made leadership and trainings and workshops accessible for young people for 24 hours in 4 different time zones, because we didn't want to let ourselves be stopped. And we wanted to make sure that we keep on providing these opportunities for young people. We were able to engage 80,000 young people across all the 4 time zones. It's either to raising awareness about the event or the workshops. And we had 50 speakers from government representatives, from public sector and educational sector. At the same time, we also said, okay, we also want to make sure that leadership continues to be provided to our own members as well. And last week, we hosted the first ever virtual International Congress of AIESEC, where we normally only engage around 500 people. And this time we were able to bring leadership at home to 13,000 members of AIESEC. And OECD was able to also be part of it, which was, I was really thankful and really excited to have them as well there. But yeah, I think that in overall, we are excited to see that there continues to be a desire for young people to keep on developing themselves and keep on searching and like getting opportunities to develop themselves. And I think that's why my call to action for every young people that is attending today is that yes, you should not see COVID-19 as a burden, but you should see it as an opportunity to relearn, to upskill yourself, to take action, build your own initiatives, but at the same time, to take on opportunities like this one, attending an event like this today. I think this is already an extremely good first step to see the way of how we are facing this COVID-19 pandemic. And yeah, I think that that's my call to action. And once again, I just want to say thank you for having AIESEC being part of it. And I'm excited to the conversations we're going to be having later on. And back to you, Danny.
Great. Well, Noelle, thank you so much for those inspiring opening words. I think it's a great way to start. And indeed, congratulations on the International Congress that you just had. Looking forward to discussing that a little bit more into this webinar. We are now going to give the floor and receive a presentation from my OECD colleague, Moritz Ader. Moritz is a policy analyst in the OECD Public Governance Directorate, where he is in charge of coordinating the portfolio on youth empowerment and intergenerational justice. Moritz has coordinated various OECD publications on this topic, including the forthcoming Global Report on Youth Empowerment and Intergenerational Justice, the policy paper, the basis of this webinar, Youth in COVID-19, Response, Recovery and Resilience, and the 2018 Youth Stocktaking report. Moritz, we've been wanting to, certainly I've been wanting to have you have a webinar on your work for well over a year, so it's great to have you. Moritz, I now turn over to you.
Thank you so much, Danny, also for the invitation. I think it's a very timely debate that we are having today. Of course, also big thanks to Noelle for your introductory remarks, and congratulations on the virtual meeting last week, which we attended really with great pleasure. It's great to see that you can mobilize so many people across the world on these important topics. But also warm welcome to the other speakers today, especially the young diplomats from Canada and the YPFP. So I'm happy to take you through the main findings of the policy paper. As some of you know already, this builds on an online survey that our team has launched in mid-April, which was targeting youth-led organizations worldwide, both at the international level, at the national level, but also subnational levels. In total, we collected 90 replies from youth organizations in 48 countries, including 28 OECD member countries. So some of those who contributed to putting all this information and data together are here with us today. So also again, a big thanks to all of you for taking the time to submit your replies and the initiatives led by your organizations to mitigate this crisis. Next slide, please. So by now we've seen that this COVID-19 crisis, its economic and social impacts have disrupted all aspects of life for all groups in society. However, when we look more specifically at different age groups, we also see this crisis is impacting the young, the middle-aged, and the elderly in quite distinct ways. And there's also an increasing understanding that when we look at the social and the economic implications of this crisis, young people, but also future generations will be significantly affected. And this is something that has been reaffirmed by the latest OECD economic outlook and the employment outlook, which were launched very recently. At the same time, in this phase of recovery in many countries, governments are mobilizing significant resources to address the health impacts, social, but also the economic impacts of the crisis, which in turn provides an opportunity for governments to invest in young people, but also future generations, to leave no age group behind. At the same time, this crisis has also shown to us that as societies, as economies, we need to become more resilient to future shocks. And we've seen through our survey that young people, youth-led organizations have played a critical role in addressing this crisis. And there is a potential for governments also to tap on this potential, on this mobilization of young people in the future. Next slide, please. So we've seen that in recent months, government have put in place a number of measures that were unthinkable prior to COVID-19, which have changed radically the way we live, the everyday life of citizens. Building trust among young people is therefore crucial, first of all, to sustain behavioral changes, but also to create their buy-in for the measures taken by governments to stop and to mitigate this crisis. We were interested in the development of young people's trust in government over the course of this crisis. When we think back to the global financial crisis in the late 2000s, we see that trust in government generally deteriorated across OECD countries, and especially so among young people. And in fact, among most of the OECD member countries, as of 2018, young people are the group in society that expresses least trust in their government when we compare it, for instance, to the middle-aged or the elderly. More recently, over the course of this crisis, young people's trust in government has been extremely volatile, especially now that governments are moving increasingly from a crisis management mode to recovery measures. And this is also confirmed by other surveys and polls. What we are presenting here is snapshot data from mid-April, but when we keep this in mind, we see that young people's trust in government has actually increased for 43% of the youth organizations that participated in our survey, while it remains stable for 36%. We were also interested to find out why does a majority of youth organizations say that their trust increased actually. And when we look at these drivers of trust, we see that young people are pointing to government's responsiveness. So were they able to provide access to critical public services to all citizens during the crisis? They were pointing to the reliability, especially when it comes to information and the communication shared by governments with their citizens. But they were also pointing to issues of integrity, openness, and fairness. And especially when we talk about fairness, we've seen that many youth-led organizations were pointing to the efforts undertaken by governments to also cater for the most vulnerable groups in society. And then in turn, for those organizations that tell us, no, my trust declined since the outbreak of this crisis, we see basically the same kind of principles, but just in a reverse logic. So the lack of responsiveness, the lack of reliability, the lack of integrity, openness, and fairness. Next slide, please. So moving from the trust question, we were interested in where do young people see the biggest challenge for other young people as a consequence of the crisis? Where are their biggest worries? And we see that the main concern of young people is in the area of mental health, education, and employment, but also related to personal relationships and the impact on disposable income. And again, these trends are confirmed by a number of other surveys and studies that demonstrate that young people actually experienced higher levels of distress, anxiety, and loneliness during the crisis. And one of the reasons why young people may feel that their impact on mental health may be more significant than for other age groups is that exactly that young people are have much more social connections than any other age group. Just to give you one example, a young person spends typically 2.5 hours more per week in social interactions than middle-aged people. When we think about the employment challenge now, young people are typically those that are holding temporary contracts, especially in those sectors that have been hit disproportionately by the crisis. Think about the restaurants, the hotels, the gig industry that had to close because of social confinement. OECD data also shows that 35% of young people are working in these sectors in low-paid and insecure jobs, which is significantly more than the middle-aged, but also the elderly. In those cases, only 15% and 16% are working in these low-paid and insecure jobs. When we think about the education, the first thing that comes to our mind is, of course, the closure of schools and universities. And many countries around the world have put in place alternative learning opportunities, e-learning solutions, virtual schooling. But despite this adjustment, it has been extremely difficult, especially for young people without access to the internet, without a computer at home, or without a quiet space to study, to actually follow the curriculum. So it has increased already existing inequalities also within the group of young people. This is, of course, a challenge for the future trajectory of a young person, but also for societies and economies more generally. So one OECD estimate says that a lost year in school can be considered equivalent to a loss of 7 to 10% of lifetime income. And that gives you an idea of the long-term implications in the social, but also in the economic field of this crisis. When we think about possible government responses to take into account such vulnerabilities, the first important thing to keep in mind is that we need to gather, to collect age disaggregated data. So data that is disaggregated by different age groups to track these kind of inequalities and inform decisions. A second point, many of the OECD member countries have put in place national youth strategies, basically as a way to get the entire government, public administration behind a joint vision for youth empowerment and youth development. 79% of OECD countries have such a strategy in place. And a couple of countries like Canada, Greece, New Zealand, and Slovenia already cover aspects related to youth empowerment and resilience in these strategies. So for other countries that do not prominently figure this topic, now would be a good time to update the strategies and make sure that the mobilization that we have seen among many youth organizations over the course of the crisis is also translating into new programs and funding for such initiatives. And then as a third way to move from these concerns that we see among young people, one key lesson is to really focus on vulnerable groups, those that are not in employment, not in education, not in training, young migrants, young people without a home, or young people that face an increased risk of domestic violence. Also a couple of studies that look into this problematic, which also suggest that across many countries, the risk of domestic violence has increased for women, but also for children, for adolescents, since the outbreak of this crisis. Next slide, please. So, as I was saying, we see that many countries are mobilizing considerable resources as a result of this crisis, which are creating not only effects in the next couple of weeks and months, but probably even for the years to come. So we were interested to see where do young people see the more medium and long-term challenges. And the study results show that it's mainly about the well-being of the elderly, but also of young people, concerns about international cooperation, sustainability, but also racial discrimination. When we talk about this aspect of solidarity, especially between different generations, we have seen that since the outbreak of the crisis, it has remained relatively strong. There are hundreds of fantastic initiatives led by youth groups to support elderly in grocery shoppings or other vulnerable groups that were at an increased risk of becoming infected. To uphold this solidarity, it is now important for governments to consider the impact of these recovery measures across different age groups. The question is, what can governments do proactively in that regard? One important thing is now that countries are moving to rulemaking, to the allocation of public resources, to keep in mind who is actually going to bear the costs of this crisis, and what can governments proactively do that these costs are allocated in a fair manner across different groups in population, across gender, across age, ethnicity, different identity factors, basically. And one interesting example to cite here is New Zealand's living standard framework that exactly looks at these distributional impacts of policymaking. Also, other countries like Canada are using impact assessments to better understand how future policies, regulations affect the young and affect the elderly, for instance. A number of other OECD countries has also created dedicated institutions, for instance, ombudsperson or parliamentary committees that look at the interests and concerns of future generations. And such institutions exist, for instance, in Finland, but also in Hungary and Wales in the United Kingdom. A second policy consideration would be to ensure that young people are actually part of the solution, that their governments are concerned about age diversity in public life and involve young people also in finding solutions to the crisis. And across many countries in Europe, we've seen that governments have put in place hackathons where they mobilize young people to find digital solutions to the crisis, to provide, for instance, access to certain services, education, employment, health to young people electronically. And then as a third important point to keep in mind, not only as a result of this crisis, but also more generally, is that we see that many young people are still underrepresented in decision-making and state institutions. That includes the parliament, the public administration, but also the cabinet. When we look at the share of young people in parliament, so basically those below 40 years, we see that worldwide, across the OECD countries, 22% are younger than 40, whereas this group in society makes up 34%. So we see just in parliament a gap of 12% in the representation of young people that we need to take into account, because ultimately this is where the decisions are being taken, and in the future we need to ensure greater age diversity also to make young people's voices heard, not only in civil society but also in and across different state institutions. Next slide, please. Of course, there are also a couple of positive developments that we see since the outbreak of the crisis when we think about the youth sector, youth organizations, volunteers that have played a critical role in mitigating the effects. And this slide shows you in which of the areas young people and youth organizations have been most active. Just to give you a couple of examples, they disseminated information about behavioral changes among their peers. They provided peer-to-peer advice in different areas, including mental health. They provided support to the elderly, other groups at risk, and they helped to combat stigma and discrimination, especially for the most vulnerable groups in society. As I was saying earlier, now the bigger question for the long term is how can governments tap and retain the current mobilization of young people? How can they strengthen new partnerships? How can they provide the adequate capacities and resources so that the youth sector, young people, can actually show the same kind of mobilization, positive mobilization in the future? And a couple of countries like France and Canada have, for instance, set up new platforms online where young people can identify opportunities for volunteering. The United Kingdom has put in place new standards and principles for their youth workers to make sure that whatever they do in times of COVID-19 is safe. But we should also think about the legal frameworks that are supportive of volunteering and of youth work. Our survey shows that around 7 out of 10 OECD countries have a national volunteering program in place. And you may ask, why is it important to have such a law in place? Because we see that those countries across the OECD that have adopted such a law and implemented thoroughly actually also see that more young people in these societies are active and volunteering. A second interesting finding from our survey is that only half of the OECD countries have a youth work law in place. And this is an area which has already suffered a lot of budget cuts as a result of the global financial crisis, but which is providing important capacities, workshops for young people outside the school. So one important way to think about future youth mobilization is to put in place also a legal framework that supports young people to be active. Next slide, please. So this is the final slide, which kind of sums it up again in terms of the policy considerations that we are presenting in the policy paper. Of course, this is only a snapshot of the results of the findings from the survey that I'm presenting here, and I invite all of you to read the paper, to contact us if you have any questions, any considerations, ideas, to tweet about the paper, to share it with your friends on Facebook. And I stop here, and I'm looking forward to any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was me there. Moritz, thank you so much for that insightful presentation, a very timely one as well, and a very timely report during these times. So one thing I'll say is, everyone, we're nearly into the Q&A. So if you do have a question, please make sure to post it in the chat box. Before we get to the Q&A, we are delighted to be joined by a former OECD colleague, Rahul Palan. Currently, Rahul is one of 4 Canadian youth delegates to the Y7 and will continue to represent Canada next year at the UK G7 Summit. Additionally, he is contributing delegate to the UN Major Group for Youth and Children. He continues to advocate for youth in the debate surrounding the recovery from COVID-19 as the head delegate on the G7 team at this year's UN WTO Pandemic Trade Policy Hackathon. Rahul served the OECD from 2016 to 2018, helping support the public affairs communications efforts of the OECD Washington Center. Rahul, it is great to have you here. I am just going to spotlight you now, and I turn to you, Rahul.
Great, thank you so much. You know, with the Y7 delegates having recently released our communicated G7 leaders, and with our colleagues at the Y20 fast approaching their own summit and negotiations, this report could not have come at a better time. I thank the OECD for saving a place for youth in the discussion and for keeping a place for us at the table. Indeed, youth can advocate as delegates to multilateral institutions. We can participate in hackathons. We can ramp up our civic engagement, but if youth voices aren't meaningfully incorporated today in the formula for post-COVID world, then we're making the same mistakes that we have in the past, increasing inequalities and potentially creating a generation of young minds that will be left out of the equation forever. As a Y7 delegate, I was heartened to see so many driven, passionate, and creative young leaders come together in response to not only COVID-19, but in support of the BLM movement and a plethora of policy areas that youth find to be of great importance today. You know, not only was the Y7 this year able to create one of the most ambitious communiques in Y7 history, but we were able to also create an actionable policy recommendation to G7 leaders and leaders around the world, consisting of 6 areas of interest and 20 policy recommendations specifically for COVID-19. You know, it speaks not only to the resilience and of the resilient nature of youth, but also what can be done in a multilateral environment when all recognize the challenges that we collectively face. I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize all of my colleagues at the Y7 and my Canadian colleagues in particular. Kirpir Chahal with UNICEF UK, Mojan Zigapur with the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, and Carla Guillaume with the Canadian Institute for Transit Research and Innovation Consortium. We've also had the pleasure of speaking with the OECD's own Nicolas Pinault, and we thank him for taking his time to speak with us about the Canadian delegation's contribution to this year's Y7 communique. It was great to see the process in which this policy paper was made possible. Consultations with youth is key to promoting and measuring the needs and desires of youth in designing fair systems for recovery. Youth find opportunity often in secure, underpaid jobs in the gig economy, in unpaid internships, and this trend is set to continue in the future with fewer opportunities available. We have a generation hit with the 2008 financial crisis and the pandemic in the span of just over a decade. The economic, financial, and personal mental health ramifications of these events will have lasting effects on this generation's ability to meaningfully contribute to their respective economies and society in general. There was already a lack of investment in youth opportunities after 2008, and with institutions across the OECD and EU area investing heavily, simply trying to keep the lights on during this pandemic, we have another hurdle for youth to overcome. That's why at the Y7, we've incorporated language into our communique, which will place a greater amount of emphasis on pre-existing frameworks and push for our support of a multilateral system, and to send the message of inclusion. One that highlights the fact that we recognize that governments will not have an appetite to fund new programs and initiatives for some time, but to demand that our governments make full use of the tools available to them, such as reports like this one, but also take advantage of the many great works of multilateral institutions like the OECD. The tools used today, the voices listened to today, and the actions taken will shape the future for a very long time to come. And it's our perspective at Young Diplomats of Canada, at the Y7, that youth have a lot to contribute if given the chance. We call on our leaders to embrace the intersectionality of global public policy making and to think of creative ways to incorporate responsible, safe, and sustainable methods to every aspect of the recovery process. Even though the pandemic has taken a majority of our attention in recent months, we cannot forget that we're in the final run-up to 2030 and that many of the goals set out in the Paris Climate Agreement have slipped through the cracks. You know, we thought that the greatest challenge in Canada was when we hit 9% unemployment in 2008. But when we fast forward to 2020, at the height of uncertainty around COVID-19, Canada saw 14% unemployment. And with the economy supposedly reopening and people getting back to work, the numbers aren't looking any better, as unemployment rate today stands just around 12.5%, almost 4% higher than the OECD average. If we don't collectively address and incorporate youth voices into the formula in a post-COVID world, we run the risk of a lost and forgotten generation of talent and minds that simply just want to make a difference. The real challenge comes when funds run dry and governments no longer have the ability to keep directly supporting citizens. We need to ensure that there's quality opportunities for employment and training available to youth so they can make a solid start in the labor market. As of 2016, 13.2% of Canadian youth were not in employment, education, or training, and this number is expected to rise in coming months due to the pandemic. This only highlights the need for employers and governments to work together in the public and private sectors to ensure that talented, educated, and driven youth and a workforce that Canada has is not left in the dark in the pandemic recovery process. 56.7% of adults in Canada have received a post-secondary education. That's almost 16% higher than the OECD average in educational attainment. And if we're facing problems of getting a workforce like that back to work here in Canada, it's clear that these problems are only going to be exacerbated further by some of our partners in the OECD and the EU moving forward as well. I'd like to quickly address youth perspectives on vaccines, where the Y7 has pushed to ensure that a multilateral approach be taken and that any advancement, therapy, cure in any shape or form must be declared a global public good without exception. For if one nation is left out of the equation, we can't claim to be on a path to recovery. I've talked a lot about getting youth back to work, listening to youth, giving us a chance to contribute, but I'd also like to highlight that youth have overwhelmingly supported the multilateral rules-based system that we have in place today. We recognize that a joint, sustainable, and deliberate effort is the only way to properly address global issues. In our consultations with youth across Canada, and indeed our colleagues at the Y7 across the G7 and EU, majority of respondents were concerned at the number of attacks and scapegoating of multilateral institutions that's been taking place over the past few years. Which is why in our communique, we've included language to safeguard these institutions and the important work that they engage in. To world leaders, I say the future is decidedly multilateral, sustainable, and inclusive. So support today means a brighter future for tomorrow. And finally, I encourage young leaders to contribute to seek, encourage young leaders to continue to seek opportunities to engage and advocate on behalf of your fellow youth around the world. But I also call on policymakers at all levels to seek opportunities to engage with youth, listen to their concerns, and figure out ways to not only incorporate youth perspectives in the formula for a more inclusive tomorrow, but also to ensure that our systems remain resilient and sustainable as they're ultimately passed on to the next generation. Youth want to contribute. We have a lot to contribute. And I think the Y7 and Y20 are platforms in which we have been able to really showcase that. And so I encourage everyone to look at the YPFP website to see the Y7 COVID response, as well as our official communicated G7 leaders. And finally, our stance against racism across the G7 and indeed around the world in our support for BLM. Those three documents, in conjunction with the OECD's report, really show how much we can contribute when given the chance. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Rahul, thank you so much for those indeed inspiring words. And I know that youth issues are something that you're evidently quite passionate about. So we're delighted to have you here and share your thoughts. We're now going to enter the Q&A. Before we do, I'd like to thank Rahul and Moritz and Noelle for giving their insights and their perspectives. And we have some questions from the audience. I myself am going to start the Q&A with a question to Noelle. Noelle, AIESEC, you recently mentioned your annual international congress, which you had over the last couple of weeks. I wanted to pose a question to you, but also Moritz and Rahul, if you want to chime in. Was there anything that really sort of stood out during the Congress in terms of thoughts and perspectives from youths? And indeed, Rahul, Moritz, you may have been participants in the International Congress, but is there anything you gentlemen have also seen or heard as a kind of pressing issue among youth? So Noelle, would love to get your perspective. Let's just see Noelle here.
Thank you. No, so one of the things that we realized was that, first of all, like normally these conferences or like the congresses that we organize as part of AIESEC are done physically. And normally we're always only able to engage around 500 young leaders of the organization due to either financial lack of financial resources to be able to travel to a specific country, or even visa restrictions. Which a lot of young people get affected by visa policies and visa restrictions to be able to either go to do an internship abroad or even have the opportunity to attend a university abroad. That is an obstacle that a lot of young people face. So one of the things that we realize is that the COVID-19 pandemic is allowing us to really make either education or like capacity building spaces more accessible for young people. But of course, we also realized that for some of the members that were attending for certain regions of the world, it still is not yet as accessible because either internet it will not allow them to be able to go through all the spaces in the best way possible. So there were still obstacles that were not allowing us to really like engage everyone. So I think that was one of the things that we realized. And some of our members were saying, how can you in the future maybe support those members that are not able to have a really stable internet connection or do not have the technical support to allow them to be part of these spaces. So I do think that yes, of course, due to all of this becoming virtually, we can access and we can provide spaces to young people, but there is still a lot of aspects that we need to, like in terms of infrastructure and these type of things, that we need to work on to be able to really make these things even more accessible, not to only those that are privileged enough to be able to have those things to attend the spaces.
Great, thank you, Noelle. Rahul, I'd like to get your perspective, just in terms of, you're obviously engaged not only in the Y7, but you're constantly in webinars and participating in events around youth. Rahul, is there anything that stood out for you? Is there a kind of common theme that you're hearing from youth in regard to the impact of COVID-19?
Yes, definitely. I think what youth are saying, especially in respect to COVID-19, is that we are looking for sustainable and resilient systems moving forward. We've identified a lot of the gaps that exist in inequalities, not only in terms of age and gender, but we're starting to see the gaps in inequalities in urban and rural communities. Essentially what youth are asking for and what we're advocating for, and across all of these platforms, is inclusive and resilient systems. And so when we consulted with youth in Canada, in the G7, the EU, there was a large push to not only incorporate the voices of fellow youth, but to ensure that senior populations were being taken care of, immigrant populations were being taken care of, refugee populations were being taken care of. And, without exception, across the G7 and EU, we have found that youth are looking for inclusivity, but then also a place at the table. I think, we have the Y7, we have the Y20, we have these hackathons, but at the end of the day, where our communiques go they only go so far when we keep on pushing them, when we stay persistent. And so I think at the end of the day, it's inclusivity and resilience that we're looking for and that we don't currently have.
Rahul, thank you for that. I'm noticing some questions. There's a common theme amongst the questions, and indeed a question I had. I'd like to turn to Moritz, but also, Rahul and Noelle, please feel free to chime in. Moritz, the OECD is continuously trying to improve its outreach efforts and levels of engagement with youth. What can multilateral organizations do, and indeed government agencies, what can they do better when communicating and developing programs that seek to engage with youth?
That's a very good question, Danny. I think we are learning every day, also at the OECD. I can tell you that we are trying for all the reports that we are publishing to get the voice of young people included through public consultations, online consultations, but also go beyond that, because typically what you're facing is the challenge of representativity. It's, I think, relatively easy to mobilize big umbrella organizations of young people, and they share their thoughts with a multilateral organization like ours. But I think what we can do better in the future is also to reach out to more vulnerable groups of young people, to understand really what it means to be homeless, to be not in education, employment, or training, to be an immigrant in a country with restrictions to rights and so on and so forth. So I think for us it has been a great learning process. We also see that, maybe just to provide you with a little bit of context, our first report on the issue for OECD member countries was published 2 years ago, where we found it quite challenging to actually get youth voices involved. I think for many young people that are maybe not part of AIESEC or the Y7, the OECD is still this big multilateral organization focused on maybe the PISA test or the tax-related work that we do. But I think we need to understand that every area, from public governance to education, employment, health, whatnot, is covered by the OECD, is a concern to young people. And we see that, thinking about youth as just being interested in employment, education is not correct. Even before the crisis, young people were involved in addressing climate change through social movements. They were raising their concerns about public debt. All these are questions that have a clearly intertemporal and therefore also intergenerational dimension. And I think making sure that young people are also part of this discussion is very crucial across all areas of the OECD.
Thank you, Moritz. Rahul, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just say that, it is clear that youth are well informed about the issues that we face today. If you look at the communiques that have been produced by the Y7 and Y20 over the past few years, you'll see that we not only care about much more than just our educational attainment and economic prospects, but we're looking for when we look at peace and security, when we're looking at energy, we're looking to ensure that the commitments that our nations sign up to, so that's the Paris Agreement, that's the SDGs in general, we're looking to actually accomplish them. It's not enough anymore to pay lip service to youth and other demographics. It's not enough simply to sign a piece of paper and say we're in support of something. There needs to be solid action. And I think youth these days are trying very hard to find as many platforms as possible to engage and help in that process, to actually get things done. That's one of the biggest sort of critiques I think I've heard a lot from naysayers about the multilateral process, is that we aren't able to get a lot of things done. And I think youth kind of have a bit of a fire under them, a fire within them to get things pushed through and to see real results, because we don't have time anymore to be waiting for another implementation of a 2030 agenda. We don't have any more time to be worrying about the environment. We need to act on these. And so I think action is something that youth can bring to the table, and we just need the space to do it.
Great, thank you, Rahul. You mentioned, Rahul, in your remarks, but also just now that the Paris Climate Agreement, the SDGs, the kind of countdown to 2030. There was a question from the audience. Right now, there's of course the immediate concern is finding a vaccine, making sure the economy doesn't collapse. Noelle, I'd like to just kind of direct this question at you first, but Moritz and Rahul, please feel free to add. To avoid, Noelle, the question is to avoid sort of, how can we avoid short-term vision with regards to youth and youth engagement in governments? What would be perhaps AIESEC's or indeed your perspective to ensuring that, working towards 2030, how do we ensure that we don't become kind of tunnel short-term vision? How do we ensure medium to long-term vision when developing policies for youth engagement?
Great. I've been having issues in unmuting myself. First of all, I just wanted to say that I agree from my side as well. A lot of the points that Moritz and Rahul were also presenting. Like I myself have been able to be part of many events throughout the last year representing AIESEC, but in many of these spaces, it was more just like a formality having a young person being part of it. Being more just saying like we are bringing young people to the table, but there was no much like follow-up or action being taken afterwards. And I think that's feedback and the critique that has been given to many organizations that do say that they are engaging with young people, but are they actually really? So I think like to be able to really like change, and I think like towards your question, to be able to really like see that it's more as a long-term thing, we need to change that behavior and that making it just a formality of having a young person attending, because I think like we have seen that for the last 5 years, and also since the Sustainable Development Goals were launched, where they were seeing that young people play a really crucial role in being able to implement them. It was only said, but like there is not, as Rahul was saying, like there's not much of the platforms that are being provided for young people to actually take action. So really like developing those systems and developing those spaces and really giving young people clearer roles of what they can do as part of this, I think would allow us to have more continuity and empowering young people. They would also stay on and either continue those initiatives, those processes, the work that is being done in the future as well. So yeah, I think that's my thought on that.
Great. So we're running we're going to run a little bit over, but I think that's okay. Rahul, I'd love to get your sort of hot take on the question about ensuring long-term vision, if you don't mind.
Sure. I think that when we're looking at the next 10 years, the 2030 agenda, we need to start meaningful action on this if we are ever going to have a roadmap for policymaking after 2030. I think we need meaningful action taking place across all SDGs. We need meaningful action being actually implemented on the Paris Climate Accord, and full support for it as well. And with those building blocks, then we can start to think about what happens post 2030. There's a lot of work to do, and we've got a decade to do it. And there's an opportunity here to kind of bring it back, but we have to act now to do that. And I think youth overwhelmingly, no matter the platform that you look at, agree that action must take place, and it's going to be a multilateral process. So we look to the OECD, we look to the United Nations system to get things done, and youth will support that.
Great. Moritz, very quickly, I'd just love to get your thoughts on that.
So I think I need to put my public governance hat on to reply to your question. I think if we talk about meaningful youth participation, how can we encourage it, not only in the short term, but the long term, is essentially a governance question. So how do we institutionalize participation? We see that countries like Denmark are now creating youth advisory board to support their Ministry of Energy in the field of climate change, to give you one example. National youth councils, advisory bodies that different line ministries can create in fields from environment to energy to education, I think are one possible way to really institutionalize that form of participation. And a second idea, also again with my governance hat on, would be to look at our laws and legal frameworks in place. Are they actually encouraging young people to participate in terms of We can start a discussion about the voting age, but we can also look at the volunteering, the youth work laws that I was referring to in my presentation, because we see in our another report, a global report that we are soon publishing on this topic, that countries with such dedicated laws in place to encourage volunteering youth work are actually achieving better results. So I would talk about institutions, but also laws in that regard.
Great. Moritz, Rahul, Noelle, thank you so much. We're going to wrap up the Q&A. I know we could go on for quite some time, but I don't think everyone would want that. So thank you for answering those questions. Indeed, thank you everyone for contributing. For closing remarks, we're first going to hear from Thamar Harrigan. Thamar is an international trade attorney, legislative policy expert, and economic development advisor. She holds both a Juris Doctorate and a Master's of Law in International Business, which she obtained in China from a joint program between the National University of Singapore and East China University of Political Science and Law. She previously served as an Obama presidential appointee as a senior advisor for intergovernmental relations at the U.S. Department of HUD. Prior to this, she served as a senior advisor to the ambassador of the Republic of Haiti at the Embassy of Washington, D.C. Thamar, it is great to have you here. I'm going to spotlight you. I hand the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Danny. I'm honored to be here and excited to hear this conversation. As the Director of Youth Summits for YPFP, I helped organize and served as the Secretary General for the Youth G7 Summit. And the reason I've been involved with YPFP and facilitating our involvement over the last few years with these youth summits is that the voice of the youth is imperative in the conversation on policymaking. And I think that this type of event, the youth summits, whether it's the Y7, the Y20, and the various other types of events, not only helps shape our policy process as future leaders, but also helps the current leaders understand that we're paying attention, that we're interested, we're engaged, and that our opinions even now matter in that process. So I commend OECD for putting this on and all of the participants and panelists that we heard from today. I think that those types of, these types of events are imperative in shaping us and helping to shape the policies that impact not only our lives, but the future. So.
Thamar, thank you so much, and indeed, thank you for being here to represent YPFP. We very much appreciate continued engagement with YPFP that the OECD Washington Center has had and looks forward to maintaining. Our final remarks will come from our OECD Deputy Secretary General, Jeffrey Schlagenhauf, an American national who took up his duties as Deputy Secretary General at the OECD at the beginning of May 2019. Prior to joining the OECD, Mr. Schlagenhauf served as the White House's Office of Management and Budget, OMB, Associate Director for Economic Policy. In that role, he served as the top economic advisor to the director. Mr. Schlagenhauf represented OMB in the Troika process that determined the economic assumptions underlying the administration's annual budget. As head of the Economic Policy Division, he supervised a team of career economists and the evidence team that focuses on implementing evidence-based policymaking across the US federal government. Jeff, it's great to have you here, not just in your role as Deputy Secretary General, but as a longtime friend of the OECD Washington Center. Jeff, I think your microphone is unmuted, so floor to you.
Thank you, Danny. Great job coordinating this. I'm going to stray while I have some prepared remarks to deliver. I want to make a couple of very personal comments here to the people who are gathered here, which is great. I'm going to start with a statement. It's a paraphrase. It says, "I need not tell you that the world situation is very serious." That's a paraphrase of how George Marshall opened his speech to the graduating class in 1947 at Harvard University. And it formed the basis, that speech did, for the Marshall Plan. And while lots of people look and know that the OECD is the successor, if you will, to the Marshall Plan, Often the US, my country, is looked at as having played the main leading role in that. But I always like to remind people, especially some of our participants today, that this was actually a joint effort between Canada, the US, and the United Kingdom. It was truly a great example of multilateral cooperation at the beginning of this. My second very personal comment is, I'm not aware of the age of people like Noelle, Moritz, and others on this call. But I'm the father of 2 boys, one age 30, one age 32. So they were graduating from college and going through school at the end of the financial crisis, to where they came out, there were no jobs available. The one had to take a job as a barista at Starbucks that he turned into a career and advanced on. But for young people here, particularly in the 30 and a little above age group, this has been an extraordinarily challenging time. For you in that age group, you've gotten the double whammy of everything that could go wrong in your lives from a career standpoint. So my advice to you is, because I graduated from college at a similar time in the US, 1980, following very desperate times in the US in terms of opportunity, hang in there. You have a very unique opportunity to provide leadership for your generation. Do not lose that opportunity. And so to go to the more formal aspect of closing this, let me thank the OECD Washington Center for organizing this. I think it's extraordinary whenever we can get events like this to have an exchange of views. It's very important, particularly with young people. You have very different perspectives than maybe an old person losing their hair or lost their hair already, like I have. Moritz, someday you'll be maybe in the same boat unless you have very good genes going forward. But I think it's very clear that, at least if we look at like the OECD's economic outlook, that youth are really at high risk here. And we need to figure out how to see that youth remain fully engaged in this process moving forward. Because one of the things when we talk about inclusive growth in things moving forward, in a lot of the agenda that we want to pursue related to the environment, other things, requires involvement. You cannot have inclusiveness without involvement. And that is one of the things I would say to youth moving forward. Don't complain if you're not involved. You need to speak up. You need to make your voice heard in order to move the agenda that you would like to see pursued moving forward. And and this is one of those things that, from my perspective, I don't care actually if I agree with the agenda you want to push forward. I may have a different perspective, but it's your generation that is going to inherit the future. And you need to put your marker down and make your voice heard. I mean, you know, we've seen, you know, from some of the data that, for instance, because we have some Canadian participation, we've seen employment drop by 33% in Canada during this time, and unemployment for teenagers 16 to 19 in Canada tripled from 7.7% to 25.2%. These consequences are cause for concern. They highlight the need for public governance to be at the heart of spurring social and economic inclusion, rebuilding trust, and ensuring the well-being of today's and future generations. COVID-19, like I mentioned earlier, second shot to hit us in 2 decades. This creates for young people a second time in a generation for great uncertainty about the future. And while this causes great challenges, again, I will say, disappointing. This is the opportunity for young generations to step up to the table and put your marker down to determine the future. So I encourage you to move forward and, push forward on this. We've looked at, governments spending immense amounts of money. And I do think that one thing when you're younger that you may have a lack of faith in government. You may have too much faith in government in terms of which direction we're going to go. But I do think coming out of this crisis, one of the most fundamental questions that needs to be addressed and advanced is to restore faith and confidence in government and other public institutions. I mean, the reality is that if citizens, and we've seen this across the globe, for instance, in France, the Gilets jaunes and others people who felt like their governments had abandoned them. They're pursuing agendas where they didn't care about the people. And I think that is really, really important. And I think in this crisis, one of the things that I've been struck by, even as an old American guy, is that youth is driving positive change. And you've gone to great lengths in mitigating the crisis, but I think it's really important for me to tell you that you need to keep up the momentum, to require support from all levels of government. And I don't just mean national governments, I mean local and global governance. And so I'm very glad to see that youth empowerment is one of the key priorities of this year's G20 presidency. So let me conclude by telling you that we're finalizing the report on youth empowerment and intergenerational justice. I know that some of the participants in today's webinar have been participating in shaping that report. And so let me just take the opportunity to really thank you for your involvement and support. This report will present the first international comparative analysis on this topic across 42 countries and the European Union. No country will solve the complex questions alone, and there's much to learn from each other moving forward. For instance, Canada's Gender-Based Analysis Plus, GBA Plus, serves as an impact assessment tool to anticipate the distributional consequences of recovery measures across gender and age, and can provide an example for other countries that seek to ensure a fair allocation of public resources across generations. I invite you to make use of the OECD as the house of good practices to engage in a discussion on what works and what doesn't. Your contribution has been vital, and we look forward to continuing discussions with you to build back better for all generations. And again, I'll just end this with a very sincere and heartfelt appeal. Be involved. Do not be discouraged. Do not think you have to win the fight all at one time. That as you look to push forward the youth agenda going forward, focus on making incremental, step-by-step process. I come from the political side of the US, which is very conservative. And one of the things I'll say is that, with hoping not to offend anybody here, that in the liberation of Europe at the end of World War II, I've often been frustrated with some of my colleagues in the US who I always felt if troops, Allied troops from Canada and the US and Australia landed in Normandy and didn't reach Berlin within the first week, they would have wanted to declare it a failure and pull out. That's not how things are done. It's done step by step, incrementally. So Noelle, Raul, the other participants, keep your nose to the grindstone, persist. While it was in a different context, a great American president, in my view, Ronald Reagan, one time made a statement after he'd lost an election. He said, "Stay true. The cause will prevail because it is right." And I think the cause of youth here is right. So do not give up, persist, pursue, and you'll prevail. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Jeff, thank you so much for not only I suppose the more formal remarks, but also the personal remarks at the beginning, and for those very inspiring words. I think that's a terrific way to end this webinar. Before we do, I of course have to give several thanks. I would first like to say thank you to all our panelists, Noelle, Moritz, Rahul, Thamar, and Jeff, for your insights, perspectives, and inspiring words. I would like to thank AIESEC for partnering with us to promote this webinar. I'd also like to thank my colleagues both here in Washington and Paris. There's been a lot of discussion today about collaboration and teamwork and partnerships. A webinar like this is not possible without a lot of people supporting it. So thank you to my colleagues in Washington and Paris for making this webinar happen and making it such a success. And I, of course, would like to thank all the attendees for joining today. If you would like to maybe follow up and engage, I did post in the chat the link to the report. You can also feel free to email me. It's Danny. Danny Ryan, R-Y-A-N, at oecd.org. More than happy to connect you with some of the panelists and indeed share with you more work that the OECD continues to do around the topic of youth. So thank you, everyone, for participating, for joining, for speaking up, for posting questions. Stay safe out there, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next OECD Washington Center webinar. And just before I disappear, or we all disappear, my email is now sent to everyone. So you can now email me. You now have it in the chat if you want to quickly grab it. So thank you all again, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danny.